The howling wind rattled the windows of the small wooden church in Alta, Utah. As Josephine Parker stood trembling at the altar, snowflakes still melting in her auburn hair. It was January 15, 1878, the date that should have been ordinary, but instead became the day her father had chosen to sell her future to the highest bidder. "Dearly beloved," intoned Reverend Simmons, his voice nearly drowned by the fury of the blizzard outside. Josephine's gaze darted toward the church doors, searching for an escape that wasn't there. The dozen witnesses huddled in their coats in the pews, more concerned with the mounting snow than the pallor of the bride's face. Harold Blacksmith, the groom, a man 30 years her senior with hands like leather and breath that reeked of whiskey, stood beside her, a satisfied smile beneath his mustache. The gold mine owner had offered her father $1,500 and forgiveness of debts in exchange for her hand. At 20 years old, Josephine had been deemed an appropriate sacrifice for the Parker family's financial salvation. "We gather here today," the Reverend continued, "to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Josephine's mother sat in the front pew, eyes cast downward, unable to watch. Her father stood proudly beside Mr. Blacksmith's associates, miners and businessmen who had traveled from Salt Lake City, despite the weather warnings, determined to witness their boss's latest acquisition. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The silence that followed was broken only by the howling wind, until the unmistakable sound of galloping hooves approached the church. The congregation turned as the doors burst open, bringing with them a flurry of snow and a tall figure silhouetted against the white wilderness. "Stop!" The man's voice rang out across the small church, commanding and certain. The newcomer stepped forward, snow falling from his long duster coat. His face was partly obscured by a snow-crusted hat, but Josephine immediately recognized the striking blue eyes of Thomas Xavier, the cowboy who had passed through town last summer and who had occupied her thoughts ever since. "This wedding cannot proceed," Thomas declared, stomping snow from his boots as he strode down the aisle, spurs jingling with each step. Harold Blacksmith turned, his face contorting with rage. "Who in blazes do you think you are, interrupting a private ceremony?" "I'm the man who's not going to stand by while you force a woman to marry against her will," Thomas replied, his hand hovering near the holster at his hip. Josephine's father stepped forward, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Xavier, I thought I made it clear you weren't welcome in Alta anymore. This is family business. Selling your daughter isn't business, Mr. Parker. It's a crime against nature." Thomas removed his hat, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, but still handsome with its strong jaw and determined expression. His eyes found Josephine's, and in them she saw the same warmth that had captured her heart months ago. "Josephine," Thomas said softly, "I promised I'd come back for you. I'm sorry it took so long." The memories of their brief summer courtship flooded back, stolen conversations by the general store, shared laughter during the town's Independence Day celebration, and the promise whispered under a star-filled sky that he would return once he'd established himself with enough land to offer her a proper life. Harold stepped between them. "This woman is about to become my wife. The arrangement is made, the papers signed. You have no say in the matter." "The lady hasn't said I do yet," Thomas countered, his gaze never leaving Josephine, "and I'd like to hear from her what she wants." All eyes turned to Josephine, who stood frozen in her hastily assembled wedding dress, her mother's old Sunday best, altered to fit her smaller frame. For months, she had been a passive participant in her own life, following her father's orders, preparing for a marriage to a man she detested. But with Thomas's arrival, something sparked inside her a will to fight, to choose her own path. "I do not want this marriage," she said, her voice gathering strength with each word. "I never have." Her father lunged forward, grabbing her arm. "You ungrateful girl. After all we've sacrificed, let her go," Thomas warned, his tone dangerous. The Reverend, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation unfolding before him, stepped back from the altar. "I cannot in good conscience continue this ceremony if the bride is unwilling." Harold's face darkened. "I paid good money for this arrangement, Parker. If your daughter backs out now, I'll take the entire homestead as compensation." Josephine's father paled. The Parker ranch was all they had, the legacy of 3 generations of hard work. "There's another way," Thomas said, drawing everyone's attention. "I've come into some property, a cattle ranch south of here. I'm willing to cover Mr. Parker's debts to Mr. Blacksmith." Harold laughed, a cruel sound. "A cowboy with a cattle ranch, what's it worth?" 2 cows and a chicken. 500 acres, 100 head of cattle, and $3,000 in the bank in Salt Lake City," Thomas replied calmly. "I've been busy these past months." A murmur ran through the church. That was significant wealth, more than Harold had offered for Josephine's hand. Josephine's heart pounded. Thomas had not only kept his promise to return, but had worked to create a future for them both. She took a step toward him, but Harold grabbed her wrist. "The deal is done," Harold insisted. "Pastor, continue the ceremony." But the Reverend shook his head. "I'll not bind anyone in matrimony against their will. Not before God, not in this church." Harold's grip tightened on Josephine's wrist until she cried out in pain. In an instant, Thomas was beside them, his hand clamped around Harold's arm. "Let her go," he growled. "Now." Harold's free hand moved toward his jacket, where Josephine knew he kept a small derringer. Before he could reach it, Thomas twisted Harold's arm behind his back, forcing him to release Josephine. "This isn't over," Harold spat as Thomas pushed him away. "You'll regret this, Xavier." "Both of you will." Josephine's father stepped forward, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. "Xavier, if you're serious about covering our debts, I am," Thomas confirmed, "but not to buy Josephine, to free her to make her own choice." The church had fallen silent, the witnesses to the interrupted wedding watching the drama unfold with rapt attention. The only sound was the whistling of the wind through the rafters and the crackling of the small stove struggling to warm the space. Josephine looked at Thomas, then at her parents, then at Harold, who stood seething beside his supporters. For the first time in her life, the power to determine her fate lay in her own hands. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I choose freedom," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. She removed the simple veil from her hair and handed it to her stunned mother. "And I choose to leave with Thomas, if he'll still have me." The smile that broke across Thomas's face was like sunrise after the longest night. "Nothing would make me happier, Joe." Harold stepped forward again, but 2 of the miners' men Josephine recognized as more decent than their employer held him back. "Mr. Blacksmith, it's not worth it," one of them muttered. "There are other women." "Not like her," Harold growled, but he didn't struggle against his men's restraining hands. Josephine's mother rose from her seat, her expression a mixture of relief and worry. "Josephine, you can't just leave. There's a blizzard out there." "Better to face the storm than a lifetime of misery," Josephine replied with newfound conviction. Thomas nodded toward the door. "I have a wagon waiting. It's sturdy with a covered top and plenty of blankets. We can make it to the next town before the worst of the storm hits." "You planned this," Josephine's father accused. "I planned to come for Josephine," Thomas corrected. "When I heard in town yesterday about this forced wedding, I knew I had to act quickly." He turned to Josephine, his expression softening. I won't force you either. The choice is truly yours. You can come with me now, or we can wait until spring when the passes are clear. But I won't let you be sold to a man you don't love. Josephine looked around the church at her mother's worried face, her father's angry one, at Harold's burning eyes, at the Reverend's relieved expression that he wouldn't have to perform a ceremony against his conscience. Then she looked back at Thomas, the man who had ridden through a blizzard to offer her a choice. I'm coming with you, she decided. Now. The finality in her voice seemed to deflate her father's anger. He slumped slightly, then nodded. Very well. But Xavier, your offer to cover our debts, that still stands. It does, Thomas confirmed. I'll have the bank send the papers next week. Then take her and go, Mr. Parker said, turning away, before the storm makes it impossible. Josephine's mother rushed forward, embracing her daughter tightly. Be safe, she whispered. Be happy. Thomas offered his arm to Josephine, and together they walked down the aisle toward the open doors where the snow continued to fall in heavy curtains. Harold's voice followed them. This isn't over, Xavier. A man doesn't forget when someone takes what's his. Thomas paused at the door, turning back to face the mine owner. She was never yours to begin with, blacksmith. Remember that. With those words, he led Josephine out into the swirling snow, toward a covered wagon hitched to two sturdy horses. He helped her climb inside, where indeed there were thick blankets and even a small brazier providing warmth. You really did plan this, she said as he settled beside her and took up the reins. I've been planning since the day I left, he replied, a smile warming his features despite the cold. I just had to accelerate my timeline when I heard the news in town. As the wagon pulled away from the church, Josephine felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Behind them lay the life others had planned for her. Ahead stretched the unknown, dangerous perhaps, but hers to choose. Where are we really going? She asked as the church disappeared into the white haze of the storm. Thomas guided the horses carefully through the deepening snow. I wasn't lying about the ranch. It's about 30 miles south, near Cedar City. The snow shouldn't be as bad there, it's lower elevation. But first, we'll stop in Provo. I have friends there who can put us up until the storm passes. And then, he glanced at her, his blue eyes serious. And then, Josephine Parker, if you'll have me properly, I'd like to court you. No arrangements. No deals, just two people finding out if what we felt last summer was real. The honesty in his voice touched her deeply. I think I already know the answer to that, she said softly, but I appreciate the chance to be sure. As they made their way through the blinding snow, Josephine found herself studying the profile of the man beside her, the determined set of his jaw, the careful way he handled the horses, the occasional glance he cast her way to ensure she was warm enough. This was a man who had risked everything to give her a choice, who had worked months to build a future that could include her. Tell me about the ranch, she urged, wanting to know more about the life he had created. Thomas's face lit up as he described the land, rolling hills perfect for grazing, a creek running through the property, a modest but solid house he had been expanding room by room. It's not grand, he admitted. Not like what Blacksmith could have given you, but it has potential. Potential is worth more than grandeur without freedom, she replied, drawing a smile from him. As they traveled, the snow gradually began to thin, and by the time they reached the outskirts of Provo late that night, it had stopped entirely. Thomas guided the wagon to a small house on the edge of town where lights still burned in the windows despite the late hour. My sister's place, he explained as he helped Josephine down from the wagon. She married a blacksmith here last year. They're expecting us. The door opened before they reached it, and a woman with the same striking blue eyes as Thomas rushed out. Thomas, We were getting worried. Her gaze fell on Josephine, taking in her wedding dress partially hidden beneath a borrowed coat. And you must be Josephine. I'm Tabitha. Come in. Come in, you both look half frozen. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, with a blazing fire and the smell of stew simmering on the stove. Tabitha's husband, James, a burly man with kind eyes, took their coats and settled them near the fire while Tabitha served them hot food and coffee. "So you actually did it," James said, shaking his head in amazement. "Rode right into a wedding and stole the bride." "That's a story folks will tell for years." "He didn't steal me," Josephine corrected firmly. "He freed me." Tabitha gave her an approving look. "I knew I'd like you, Josephine Parker. My brother's been talking about you since summer. Wouldn't stop, in fact." It was Josephine said this, and Josephine thinks that, until we finally told him to either go get you or stop torturing us with tales of your perfection. Thomas flushed, the color visible even in the firelight. "Tabby, please." Josephine found herself smiling, truly smiling for the first time in months. "I'd like to hear more about these tales of my perfection." As the night grew later, Tabitha showed Josephine to a small guest room. "You'll stay here," she said. "Thomas will sleep in the barn with the horses." "Is that necessary?" Josephine asked, then blushed at her own boldness. Tabitha's expression softened. "It is if you want folks to respect you when you reach Cedar City. Thomas wants to do right by you, Josephine. That means protecting your reputation as well as your freedom." Josephine nodded, understanding. Though she had defied convention by leaving with Thomas, there were still social rules that would affect their future. She would need to be accepted by the community they would live in. "Thank you, Tabitha, for everything." Left alone in the small, neat room, Josephine changed out of her wedding dress into a nightgown Tabitha had lent her. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she let the events of the day wash over her. Hours ago, she had been standing at an altar, about to be married to a man she feared. Now she was free, with a future that suddenly held promise. A soft knock at the door startled her. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders before opening it to find Thomas standing there, already dressed for the cold night in the barn. "I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable," he said, his eyes carefully avoiding looking too directly at her in her nightclothes, "and to say good night." "I'm more comfortable than I've been in months," she assured him. "Thomas, I don't know how to thank you for what you did today." He shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. I couldn't stand the thought of you married to Blacksmith." "Not when," he stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Not when what?" she prompted. "Not when I've been in love with you since the moment you corrected my grammar at the general store last July," he finished, a sheepish smile playing at his lips. Josephine remembered that day clearly, how she had overheard him asking for them beans, and couldn't help but tell the educated cowboy that "those beans" was the proper phrasing. Instead of taking offense, he had laughed and thanked her for the lesson. "That's the moment you fell in love with me." "When I was being insufferably proper." "That's the moment I knew you were different from any woman I'd ever met," he corrected. The falling in love happened gradually with every conversation after that. In the soft lamplight of the hallway, with snow still melting in his dark hair, Thomas Xavier looked at her with such honest affection that Josephine felt her heart swell. "I think I started falling for you when you helped Mrs. Wilkins with her groceries," she admitted. "You didn't know anyone was watching, but I saw how gentle you were with her, how patient." They stood there, the space between them charged with unspoken feelings, until Thomas cleared his throat. "I should go. We have a long journey tomorrow if the weather clears." "Good night, Thomas," she said softly. "Good night, Josephine." He hesitated, then reached out to gently touch her cheek. "I'm glad you're here, safe." After he left, Josephine returned to the bed, but sleep was slow to come. Her mind was too full of the day's events, of the man sleeping in the cold barn, and of the uncertain but promising future that lay before them. Morning brought clear skies and news that the roads south were passable. After a hearty breakfast prepared by Tabitha, they prepared to depart. James had checked the wagon and horses, ensuring everything was ready for the journey ahead. "You'll need to reach Cedar City before dark," he advised as he helped load their few belongings. "The temperature drops quick this time of year." Tabitha pressed a package of food into Josephine's hands. "For the road," she explained. "And this," she added, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, "is one of my dresses. It should fit you well enough until you can get your own things." Josephine embraced the woman who had so quickly become an ally. "Thank you for everything." Tabitha hugged her back tightly. "You make him happy. That's thanks enough." As they said their goodbyes and climbed back into the wagon, Josephine noticed Thomas watching her. "What is it?" she asked. "Just thinking how different today is from yesterday," he replied. "Yesterday, I wasn't sure I'd find you in time. Today, you're here beside me and we're heading home." The word home sent a warm flutter through Josephine's chest. "Tell me more about this home," she requested as they left Provo behind and headed south. "What's it like?" Thomas's face lit up as he described the ranch in greater detail, the barn he had built with his own hands, the vegetable garden he had started but needed a more knowledgeable touch, the fruit trees that were still young but promised abundant harvests in years to come. "It sounds wonderful," Josephine said sincerely. "It's a work in progress," he admitted. "Much like me, I suppose." The journey south took them through changing landscapes, from snow-covered mountains to valleys where the white blanket was already beginning to melt under the winter sun. They talked constantly, sharing stories of their lives, discovering the many ways their paths might have crossed before that summer day at the general store. "My father wasn't always like this," Josephine explained as they stopped to rest the horses beside a half-frozen stream. "The drought 2 summers ago hit our farm hard, and then my brother Daniel took sick last winter. The doctors in Salt Lake City were expensive, but Father would spare no expense to save him." "I'm sorry about your brother," Thomas said gently. Josephine nodded, the grief still fresh. "He was only 16. After he died, something in Father broke. The debts mounted, and when Mr. Blacksmith made his offer, Father saw it as the only way to save what remained of our family legacy." "He should have found another way," Thomas said firmly, "not sacrificed his daughter." "I agree," Josephine replied, surprising herself with her own certainty. "But I understand his desperation, even if I can't forgive his choice." As they continued their journey, Josephine found herself increasingly drawn to Thomas, not just for his dramatic rescue, but for the man he revealed himself to be mile by mile. He was thoughtful, intelligent despite his lack of formal education, and possessed a quiet strength that reassured rather than intimidated. By late afternoon, they began to see signs of civilization again, farms scattered across the landscape, then the outskirts of Cedar City. Thomas guided the wagon through town, nodding to people who called greetings. Josephine noted how many seemed genuinely pleased to see him, a good sign for her own acceptance in this community. "Just a few more miles," Thomas promised as they left the town behind and headed west toward the mountains. "The ranch is nestled in that valley ahead." As they crested a small hill, Josephine got her first glimpse of what Thomas had been describing all day: a sprawling property with a modest but well-built house, a large barn, and pastures where cattle grazed despite the patches of snow. A creek wound through the property, catching the late afternoon sunlight. "Thomas, it's beautiful," she breathed. The pride in his eyes was unmistakable. "It's taken a lot of work, and there's still plenty to do." "I'm not afraid of work," she assured him as he guided the wagon down the slope toward the house. As they approached, a figure emerged from the barn, an older man with weathered features who waved in greeting. "That's Hank," Thomas explained. "He helps me with the cattle." Lives in the small cabin behind the barn. Hank approached as Thomas brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house. His curious gaze moved from Thomas to Josephine. "So you found her," he said simply. "Glad to see you made it back safe, both of you. Weather's been mighty unpredictable." "Hank, this is Josephine Parker," Thomas introduced. "Josephine, this is Henry Mitchell, the best cattle hand in the territory and a fair cook besides." Josephine extended her hand, which the older man took with surprising gentleness. "Pleased to meet you, Mr. Mitchell. Call me Hank, miss." "Everyone does." His eyes twinkled. "Thomas has been planning this rescue of yours for months. Good to see it worked out." Thomas helped Josephine down from the wagon. "Everything been all right here, right as rain," Hank confirmed. "Lost one calf to the cold spell last week, but the rest of the herd's holding strong." He gestured toward the house. "Got a stew going inside. Figured you'd be hungry after the journey." "You're a godsend, Hank," Thomas said gratefully. "We'll just get settled and then we can all eat together." As Hank returned to the barn to finish his chores, Thomas led Josephine to the house. It was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a main structure with recent additions visible in the slightly different color of the wood. "I've been adding to it," Thomas explained as he opened the door. "Started with just 2 rooms last spring, but now there's a proper kitchen, a sitting room and 2 bedrooms." Inside, the house was simple but comfortable, with sturdy furniture and touches that spoke of care. Curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the sofa, bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, and the promised stew simmered on the stove. "It's lovely," Josephine said sincerely, taking in what might soon be her home. Thomas watched her nervously. "The second bedroom is yours, of course. It's small, but I thought you might like having your own space, at least until—" He stopped, coloring slightly. "Until what?" she prompted, though she suspected she knew. "Until we decide what happens next," he finished diplomatically. "I meant what I said about courting you properly, Josephine. I won't rush you." The consideration in his words touched her deeply. Harold Blacksmith would never have considered her comfort or desires. She would have been his property, existing solely for his pleasure and convenience. Thomas, by contrast, was offering her time, space, and the freedom to choose. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. For the rescue, for this home, for your patience." He smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "You're worth waiting for, Josephine Parker." In that moment, standing in the warm kitchen with the man who had risked everything to give her a choice, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right decision in leaving Alta with Thomas Xavier. The next weeks passed in a rhythm of work and discovery, as Josephine settled into life at the ranch. Each day brought new experiences, learning to tend the chickens Hank kept behind the barn, helping prepare meals in the kitchen that gradually began to feel like her own, exploring the boundaries of the property on horseback with Thomas as her guide. Thomas, true to his word, courted her with respectful determination. There were gifts, simple but thoughtful items like a journal for her writing, wildflowers gathered during his daily rides, a set of hairpins from the general store in Cedar City. There were also long conversations by the fire each evening, sharing dreams and fears, building the foundation of something deeper than the initial attraction that had drawn them together. Word of their dramatic meeting had spread throughout the region, and Josephine soon discovered that most of the community viewed their story with romantic approval rather than scandalous disapproval. The fact that Thomas had established himself as a respected rancher, before bringing her to his home helped considerably with their acceptance. A month after their arrival, Thomas received word that Harold Blacksmith had indeed accepted the payment for the Parker family's debts, though not without threatening legal action for the theft of his intended bride. The local sheriff in Alta, however, had refused to pursue charges, stating that no woman could be considered property to be stolen. "So it's truly over," Josephine said with relief when Thomas shared the news. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and purple. "Blacksmith has no claim on me." "He never did," Thomas replied firmly. "But yes, legally and practically, it's over. Your father's debts are cleared and Blacksmith has moved on. I heard he's courting a widow from Salt Lake City now." "Poor woman," Josephine murmured, then smiled at Thomas. "I'm glad my father's debts are settled, though. Perhaps someday he'll understand why I couldn't go through with the wedding." Thomas reached over, taking her hand in his. "Have you thought about writing to your mother? I'm sure she worries about you." Josephine nodded. "I've started a letter several times, but the words never seem right. How do I explain that I'm living here with you without marriage, without—" She broke off, embarrassed. "Without compromising your reputation," Thomas finished for her. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, sending warmth up her arm. "I've been thinking about that too." Their eyes met in the fading light, and Josephine felt the now familiar flutter in her chest that accompanied these quiet moments together. "Have you?" she asked softly. Thomas nodded, suddenly serious. "Josephine, I know it's only been a month since I rode into that church, and I promised to give you time. But my feelings haven't changed, they've only grown stronger. I love you. I think I have since that first summer, and every day with you here confirms what I already knew." He shifted, turning to face her fully. "I'm not asking for an answer today. I just want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would be honored to make this arrangement permanent. To have you as my wife, not because of any deal or obligation, but because we choose each other freely." Josephine's heart pounded at his words. Over the past month, her initial gratitude toward Thomas had deepened into genuine affection, and then into something more profound. She had come to admire his integrity, his patience, his quiet strength. She had also come to desire his touch, to look forward to the brief moments when his hand would brush hers or when he would help her down from her horse, his strong hands at her waist. "Thomas," she began, her voice steadier than she expected, "you don't need to wait any longer. I already know my heart." His blue eyes widened with hope. "And what does your heart tell you?" "That I love you too," she admitted, the words bringing with them a sense of rightness. "That I want to build a life here with you. That I would be proud to be your wife." The smile that broke across his face was like sunshine after storm clouds. Without a word, he leaned forward, one hand coming up to gently cup her cheek as his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand, but when Josephine responded, sliding her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more powerful. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes, Josephine Parker? Will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, her heart full to bursting. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Xavier." The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Cedar City. Unlike the forced ceremony in Alta, this one was filled with joy and genuine celebration. Josephine wore a new dress of pale blue that Thomas had ordered from Salt Lake City, with flowers in her hair instead of a veil. Thomas stood tall and proud in a new suit, his usually tanned face slightly pale with nerves, until she appeared at the back of the church. The town turned out for the occasion, curious to see the culmination of the romantic tale they had heard so much about. Even Tabitha and James had made the journey from Provo to witness their happiness. Most surprising of all was the arrival, just before the ceremony began, of Josephine's mother. She had made the difficult journey alone, against her husband's wishes, determined to see her daughter married properly to the man who had saved her from a loveless future. "He won't admit it, Mrs. Parker whispered as she embraced Josephine in the small anteroom of the church. "But your father knows in his heart that Thomas did the right thing. Perhaps someday his pride will allow him to say it." When Josephine walked down the aisle on this day, it was with joy rather than dread. The man waiting for her at the altar looked at her with such love that she felt her heart might burst from happiness. "Dearly beloved," began the minister, and this time Josephine listened to every word, her hands clasped tightly in Thomas's as they promised to love, honor, and cherish one another for all their days. When Thomas kissed her as his wife for the first time, the small church erupted in cheers and applause. Outside, the January sky was clear and bright, with no hint of the snowstorms that had marked their first meeting. As they emerged into the sunlight, Josephine felt as though her life was truly beginning anew. The celebration continued at the ranch, where Hank and several neighbors had prepared a feast. Tables had been set up in the yard, with lanterns hanging from tree branches to provide light as evening approached. There was music from local musicians, dancing, and more food than Josephine had seen in one place since before her family's troubles began. "Are you happy, Mrs. Xavier?" Thomas asked as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. Josephine smiled up at him, her heart full. "Happier than I ever thought possible. And you?" "I've never been happier in my life," he assured her, pulling her closer as they moved across the improvised dance floor. "Though I still can't quite believe you're really my wife." "Believe it," she whispered, stretching up to kiss him briefly, heedless of the smiling onlookers. "I'm exactly where I want to be." As the celebration continued into the night, Josephine found herself watching Thomas as he moved among their guests, thanking them for coming, introducing her mother to neighbors, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. This was the man she had chosen, so different from the one who had almost been forced upon her. This was the beginning of a life built on mutual respect and love rather than ownership and obligation. Later that night, when the guests had departed and they were finally alone in the house that was now truly their shared home, Thomas took her hands in his. "I've been saving something for this day," he said, leading her to the sitting room where a small package waited on the table. "I wanted you to have a proper wedding gift." Josephine unwrapped the package to find a small wooden box, beautifully carved with wildflowers and her new initials. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. "Open it," Thomas encouraged. Inside the locket was a tiny painting, a miniature landscape of their ranch, rendered with surprising skill and detail. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Did you paint this?" Thomas nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "It's a hobby I rarely mention. My mother taught me when I was young, before she passed. I wanted you to have something personal, something that represented our home and our future together." Touched beyond words, Josephine let him fasten the locket around her neck, its weight a pleasant reminder of his thoughtfulness. "I'll treasure it always," she promised. That night, as they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that the path that had led her here, though fraught with fear and uncertainty, had been the right one. In Thomas's tender embrace, she found not possession but partnership, not dominance but mutual desire. Spring arrived early that year, bringing new growth to the ranch and new rhythms to their shared life. Josephine wrote regularly to her mother, sharing stories of her happiness and her growing comfort with ranch life. Mrs. Parker responded with news from Alta and tentative suggestions that perhaps she might visit again in the summer. Of Mr. Parker there was little mention, though Josephine continued to hope that time might soften his anger. Thomas's cattle business thrived under his careful management, and with Josephine's help, the vegetable garden expanded to provide much of their food. She had discovered a talent for preserving fruits and vegetables, trading her jams and pickles with neighbors for items they couldn't produce themselves. By summer's end, Josephine had news of her own to share. She was expecting their first child, due to arrive with the spring thaw. Thomas's joy at the announcement was boundless. He immediately set to work expanding the house again, adding a nursery adjacent to their bedroom and reinforcing the roof before winter storms could arrive. "You've thought of everything," Josephine observed as she watched him build a cradle in the evenings, his large hands surprisingly deft with the delicate work. "I want everything to be perfect for you both," he replied, testing the smoothness of the wood. "I never thought I'd have this, Josephine, a wife I adore, a child on the way, this land. Sometimes I wake up afraid it's all been a dream." She moved to stand behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "Not a dream," she assured him. "Just the life we've built together." As her pregnancy progressed, the ranch continued to prosper. Thomas hired 2 more hands to help with the expanding herd, allowing him to spend more time close to home as Josephine's time approached. They had become well established in the community, with Josephine teaching reading at the small school in town once a week, and Thomas serving on committees that managed water rights and grazing territories. Winter came again, bringing with it memories of their dramatic meeting the year before. On the anniversary of the day Thomas had burst into the church in Alta, they celebrated quietly at home, grateful for the journey that had brought them together. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked as they sat before the fire, his hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. "Leaving with me that day?" Josephine considered the question seriously, as she did all of Thomas's questions. "Not for a moment," she said finally. "I regret that my father was hurt, that our relationship remained strained, but I have never regretted choosing my own path." Thomas's expression softened with relief. "I've never regretted it either, not even when Blacksmith's men tried to cause trouble at the cattle auction in April." Josephine frowned at the memory. Harold Blacksmith had indeed tried to interfere with their business, sending men to discourage buyers from dealing with Thomas. The attempt had backfired when the community rallied around the young rancher, whose romantic story had captured their imagination. "Blacksmith is part of the past," she said firmly. "Our future is what matters now." As if in agreement, the baby kicked strongly, causing them both to laugh. Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. "Our future," he repeated contentedly. That future arrived earlier than expected, in the form of their son James Thomas Xavier, born during a February blizzard that rivaled the one that had marked his parents' first journey together. The birth was difficult, long, and complicated enough that Thomas had ridden through the storm to bring the doctor from Cedar City. When it was over, with mother and child both safe though exhausted, Thomas sat beside the bed, his son cradled somewhat awkwardly in his arms, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He's perfect," he whispered, looking from the infant to Josephine with wonder. "You're both perfect." Josephine, tired but radiant, reached out to touch her husband's tear-streaked cheek. "We made him, Thomas, together." The tenderness in Thomas's expression as he gazed at their child sealed in Josephine's heart the certainty that she had found true happiness not in wealth or social position, but in the love of a good man and the family they were building. As spring returned to the valley, bringing with it new calves and fresh growth, Josephine often sat on the porch with little James, watching Thomas work with the cattle or tend to the fruit trees that were finally beginning to bear. These quiet moments of contentment were interrupted one afternoon by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Her father sat stiffly on his horse at the edge of their property, looking older and more careworn than when she had last seen him. Thomas spotted him first, immediately making his way to the house to alert Josephine. "Your father's here," he said without preamble. "Do you want me to send him away?" Josephine looked up from the baby sleeping in her arms, surprised by the news but somehow not shocked. "No," she decided after a moment. "It's time we made peace if he's willing." Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "I'll bring him to the house then. But Josephine, if he upsets you, he leaves immediately." She smiled at her husband's protectiveness. "Agreed." When her father entered their home, hat in hand, his eyes immediately went to the infant in Josephine's arms. Something in his stern countenance softened at the sight of his grandson. "Father," Josephine said calmly, "this is a surprise." "Josephine." He nodded awkwardly. "Your mother thought it was time I saw for myself that you were well, that I met my grandson." Thomas stood slightly behind Mr. Parker, his posture making it clear that he was ready to intervene if necessary. But Josephine saw in her father's eyes not anger but regret, and perhaps a tentative hope for reconciliation. "Would you like to hold him?" she offered, extending the sleeping bundle. "This is James Thomas Xavier." The moment her father took his grandson in his arms, something fundamental shifted in the room. The old man's face transformed as he looked down at the child, a smile breaking through the stern exterior. "He has your mother's nose," he observed gruffly, "and your chin." "Thomas says he has my stubbornness already," Josephine replied, drawing a reluctant chuckle from her father. "That would be fitting," he conceded. Looking up, he met her eyes directly for the first time. "Josephine, I came to say that I was wrong, about Blacksmith, about the arrangement. Your mother has been telling me so for months, but I was too proud to listen." The admission clearly cost him, but he continued. "Seeing you now with your child in this home you've built, it's clear you made the right choice, even if I couldn't see it then." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes at the unexpected apology. "Thank you, Father. That means a great deal to me." Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand to the older man. "Mr. Parker, you and Mrs. Parker are always welcome here. This is your grandson's home, and we'd like it to be a place where family comes together." After a moment's hesitation, Mr. Parker shifted the baby to one arm and took Thomas's offered hand. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for, Xavier. Thank you for taking care of my daughter when I failed to do so." The visit marked the beginning of a cautious reconciliation. Though things would never be entirely as they had been before, the rift began to heal. Mrs. Parker visited more frequently, sometimes bringing Mr. Parker with her. Josephine found that parenthood had given her a new perspective on her father's actions, not excusing them, but understanding more deeply the desperate desire to protect one's child, even when the methods were misguided. As little James grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered under Thomas and Josephine's joint care. They added more land, more cattle, and eventually more children: a daughter, Elizabeth, born 2 years after James, and another son, Daniel, named after Josephine's late brother, who arrived 2 years after that. Through the years, through droughts and abundant harvests, through illness and health, through challenges and triumphs, the foundation of their life together remained the choice they had made that snowy day in Alta, to believe in love that was freely given rather than coerced, to trust in each other's strength, to build something meaningful together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Josephine with a journey back to Alta. The town had changed, with new buildings and new faces, but the small church still stood where their story had begun. Standing in front of it, snow falling gently around them just as it had that day, Thomas took her hands in his. 10 years ago, I made the best decision of my life when I rode through a blizzard to find you, he said softly. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Josephine squeezed his hands, her heart full of the love that had only deepened with the passing years. And I would leave with you again, every time. As they stood there, their 3 children playing in the snow nearby under the watchful eye of Josephine's parents, they shared a kiss that held all the passion of their youth and all the deeper connection of the decade they had spent building their life together. Later, as they gathered with family and old friends in the newly built hotel in Alta for a celebration, Josephine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. From a frightened bride being forced into marriage, to a confident woman surrounded by the family she had chosen and created, the transformation seemed almost impossible to comprehend. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, finding her alone by the window, watching the snow fall outside. "About how different things might have been if you hadn't come that day," she replied honestly. "About how grateful I am that you did." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her against his chest. "I sometimes wonder if I was too impulsive, bursting into a church like that. But then I look at our children, at our life together, and I know it was the only thing I could have done." Josephine turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to trace the lines that 10 years of sun and wind and laughter had etched around his eyes. "It was impulsive," she agreed with a smile. "Dramatic, romantic, and perfectly right." As they rejoined the celebration, moving among friends and family, sharing stories and laughter, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that their story, begun in defiance and desperation, had become something beautiful and enduring. What had started with a desperate escape had blossomed into a life richer and more fulfilling than either of them could have imagined on that snowy day when a cowboy rode into a church and said, "Stop." The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. James, their firstborn, grew into a serious young man with his father's way with horses and his mother's love of books. Elizabeth became a spirited girl with her grandmother's artistic talent and a determination that often reminded Josephine of herself at that age. Young Daniel, the most easygoing of the 3, showed early signs of Hank's talent with cattle, following the old man around the ranch from the moment he could walk. Hank himself remained a constant presence, becoming more family than employee as time went on. Though he had opportunities to work on larger ranches for better pay, he stayed with the Xaviers, eventually moving into a larger cabin that Thomas built specifically for him closer to the main house. "You couldn't pay me enough to leave this family," he told Thomas when questioned about his loyalty. "Besides, someone's got to teach these youngsters how to really work cattle." The ranch expanded steadily under their care, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. Thomas's fair business practices and Josephine's skill at managing the household accounts meant that even during lean years, they weathered financial challenges better than many of their neighbors. Their 15th anniversary arrived with an unexpected announcement from James, now 14 and nearly as tall as his father. "I want to go to school in Salt Lake City," he declared over dinner. "The academy there has programs in engineering and agriculture. I think it could help us modernize the ranch." Thomas and Josephine exchanged surprised glances. Though they had always encouraged their children's education, sending them to school in Cedar City and supplementing with books and lessons at home, they hadn't expected James to want to leave the ranch for his studies. "That's quite a distance," Thomas said carefully. "And expensive besides." "I've been saving," James replied, his determination evident. "From the calves you let me raise and sell. It's not enough for all of it, but I could work while I study." Josephine looked at her son so much like Thomas in his quiet determination, yet with her own thirst for knowledge. "We'll need to discuss this," she told him. "Your father and I will consider it." Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Thomas voiced his conflicted feelings. "He's young to go so far on his own, but I don't want to hold him back from something he wants so badly." Josephine sat at her dressing table, brushing out her hair, still auburn but now with strands of silver threading through it. "I think we should let him go," she said after consideration. "James knows his own mind, and this desire to learn, to improve, we should encourage it, not stifle it." Thomas sighed, sitting on the edge of their bed. "I suppose I was hoping he'd take over the ranch someday, continue what we've built." "Perhaps he will," Josephine suggested, setting down her brush and moving to sit beside her husband. "But with new knowledge, new methods." "The world is changing, Thomas. Maybe James sees that more clearly than we do." Thomas put his arm around her, pulling her close. "When did you get so wise, Josephine Xavier?" she smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I've had an excellent teacher in knowing when to hold on and when to let go." In the end, they supported James's decision. Thomas rode with him to Salt Lake City, helped him find suitable lodging, and arranged for the academy's tuition to be paid in full, a surprise that brought rare tears to his son's eyes. "We're proud of you," Thomas told him as they said goodbye. "Your mother and I both. This is your chance to forge your own path, just as we did." With James away at school, life at the ranch shifted once more. Elizabeth, at 12, took on more responsibility, particularly with helping Josephine manage the household. Daniel, at 10, spent increasingly more time with the cattle under Hank's watchful guidance. Letters arrived regularly from James, full of excitement about his studies and the new ideas he was encountering. His descriptions of city life amused the family during evening readings around the fireplace, particularly his accounts of social events that clearly made the ranch-raised boy uncomfortable. "Poor James," Elizabeth giggled after one such letter. "Having to dance with girls in fancy dresses." "How terrible! You laugh now," Josephine told her daughter with a knowing smile. "But your time will come." Indeed, as Elizabeth blossomed into young womanhood, Josephine found herself reflecting on her own youth and the different circumstances her daughter faced. Where Josephine had been pressured into an unwanted match, Elizabeth would have the freedom to choose or not choose as her heart dictated. This thought was much on Josephine's mind the summer Elizabeth turned 16. When a young man from a neighboring ranch began finding reasons to visit with increasing frequency. Michael Johnson was polite, hardworking, and clearly smitten with Elizabeth, who alternated between feigned indifference and poorly concealed interest. "Should we be concerned?" Thomas asked one evening after Michael had stayed for dinner, his attention to Elizabeth obvious to everyone. "About Michael, I don't think so," Josephine replied, folding laundry while Thomas reviewed accounts at the kitchen table. "He seems respectful enough, and Elizabeth has a good head on her shoulders." "She's young," Thomas pointed out. "Younger than I was when I met you," Josephine reminded him. "But with a very different father who will let her make her own choices." Thomas looked up from his ledger, his expression softening. "You always know the right thing to say to put things in perspective." The following spring brought both joy and sorrow to the Xavier family. James returned from his schooling with new ideas for irrigation systems that could revolutionize their use of water during the dry summer months. His homecoming was celebrated with a gathering that brought neighbors from miles around to welcome the educated young man back to the community. But the celebration was tempered by Hank's declining health. The old cowboy who had been such an integral part of their family for nearly 20 years was failing, his once robust frame now thin and frail. "Don't you all look so glum," he scolded as the family visited him in his cabin. "I've had a good, long run, better than most." "We're not ready to lose you, Hank," Josephine said softly, holding his weathered hand in hers. "Well now, Mrs. Xavier, that's mighty kind of you to say, but I reckon the good Lord's got other plans for me soon enough." His rheumy eyes twinkled with their old humor. "Just promise you'll bury me here on this land where I can keep an eye on things." "You have our word," Thomas assured him, his voice rough with emotion. Hank passed peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later. As promised, they buried him on the ranch, on a hilltop overlooking the valley with a simple marker that read, "Henry Hank Mitchell Friend, Teacher Family." The loss affected them all deeply, but perhaps none more than Daniel, who had spent so many hours learning from the old cowhand. In the weeks after Hank's passing, the boy could often be found at the grave site, sometimes talking to Hank as though he were still there to offer advice. "Is he all right?" Thomas asked Josephine one evening, watching from the porch as Daniel made his way back from the hillside. "He's grieving," Josephine replied, "but he's also finding his own way to honor Hank's memory. I think he'll be fine given time." Summer turned to fall, and with it came preparations for a joyous occasion, James's wedding to Catherine Miller, the daughter of the bank manager in Cedar City. They had met during James's visits home from school, and their courtship had progressed with a steadiness that reminded Josephine of Thomas's patient wooing of her all those years ago. The wedding was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the same yard where Thomas and Josephine had celebrated their own marriage 20 years earlier. Catherine, beautiful in a gown of cream lace, and James, handsome in a new suit, exchanged vows beneath an arch Thomas had built for the occasion. As Josephine watched her firstborn pledge his life to the woman he loved, she found herself overwhelmed with emotion. Thomas's arm slipped around her waist, his presence a steadying comfort as always. "They look happy," he murmured. "Reminds me of us." "They have something we didn't, though," Josephine replied softly. "A good beginning with their family's blessing." Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. "Our beginning might have been unconventional, but I wouldn't change a moment of it." The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing under stars that seemed to shine especially bright. When the last guests had departed, and James had taken his bride to the small house Thomas had built for them on the eastern edge of the ranch property, Josephine found herself standing in the yard, reluctant to end such a perfect day. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, coming to stand beside her, his arm slipping easily around her waist, a gesture so familiar after 20 years together that it felt like an extension of her own body. "I'm thinking about that day in Alta," she admitted. "About how terrified I was standing at that altar, and how everything changed when you burst through those doors." Thomas turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. In the moonlight, she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes and mouth evidence of years of sun and wind and laughter. To Josephine, he was more handsome now than he had been as the young cowboy who had rescued her. "If I had to do it all over again," he said seriously, "I'd still ride through that blizzard. I'd still interrupt that wedding. I'd still bring you home to this ranch and spend 20 years building this life with you." Josephine felt tears welling in her eyes at the simple sincerity in his voice. "And I would still leave with you," she whispered. "Every time." He pulled her close, his arms encircling her with the familiar strength that had been her haven through 2 decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. As their lips met in a kiss that held all the passion of their youth and all the deeper connection of their shared life, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that the choice she had made that snowy day in Alta had been the beginning of the greatest adventure of her life, an adventure that continued to unfold with each passing day. That night, lying in Thomas's arms in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Josephine felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life they had built together. From the frightened young woman forced to the altar against her will, to the confident matriarch of a thriving family and ranch, the journey had been remarkable. "Thomas," she murmured, her head resting on his chest where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. "Do you remember what you said to me the day you proposed? That you never thought you'd have all this, a wife, children, this land?" "I remember," he replied, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "I wake up sometimes still amazed by it all." "So do I," she admitted. "Especially on days like today, seeing James so happy, Elizabeth and Daniel growing up so strong and sure of themselves. Sometimes it seems impossible that all of this grew from that desperate escape in a snowstorm." Thomas's arms tightened around her. "Not impossible, just unlikely. Like finding the perfect partner in a woman who corrects your grammar in a general store." Josephine laughed softly, the sound muffled against his chest. "We were meant to find each other, I think, despite all the obstacles. Or perhaps because of them," Thomas suggested thoughtfully. "Would we appreciate this life as much if it had come easily?" The question lingered in Josephine's mind as she drifted toward sleep, secure in her husband's embrace. Their path had indeed been marked by challenges, from that initial dramatic escape to the hardships of building a ranch, from financial struggles during lean years to the personal losses they had weathered together. Yet each obstacle overcome had strengthened their bond. Each challenge met had deepened their appreciation for the life they shared. As the years continued to pass, the Xavier Ranch thrived under the combined efforts of the family. James and Catherine welcomed children of their own, first a son they named Henry in honor of Hank, then twin daughters who kept the young parents perpetually busy. They lived in the house Thomas had built for them, gradually expanding it as their family grew, while James implemented the innovative farming and ranching techniques he had studied. Elizabeth, to no one's surprise, eventually married Michael Johnson, the young man who had been so obviously smitten with her for years. Their courtship had been lengthy, with Elizabeth insisting on teaching for 2 years at the Cedar City School before agreeing to become a rancher's wife. Their wedding, held when she was 20, was a joyous celebration that brought together the 2 neighboring ranching families. Daniel, the youngest, took the longest to settle. After Hank's death, he had thrown himself into learning every aspect of cattle ranching, becoming known throughout the region for his skill with difficult animals and his innovative breeding programs. It wasn't until he was 25 that he met Anna Williams, a widow with a young son who had moved to Cedar City to work as a seamstress. Their courtship was brief but heartfelt, and when they married, Thomas and Josephine welcomed both Anna and her son into the family with open arms. Through it all, Thomas and Josephine remained the center of the expanding family circle, hosting Sunday dinners that brought everyone together, mediating the occasional disagreement, celebrating achievements, and offering comfort during setbacks. As grandchildren arrived, they found themselves busier than ever, with Josephine teaching little ones to read and bake, while Thomas introduced them to horses and cattle with the same patience he had shown his own children. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children surprised them with a party that brought friends and neighbors from miles around to celebrate the couple whose dramatic beginning had become something of a local legend. The small church in Alta, where their story had begun, sent a delegation including the now elderly Reverend Simmons, who had refused to continue the forced ceremony all those years ago. I never did get to perform a proper wedding for you two, he teased as he embraced Josephine. But it seems to have worked out nonetheless. As the celebration continued around them, Thomas drew Josephine aside, leading her to a quiet corner of the yard where they could observe the gathering without being overheard. 30 years, he said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I rode into that church. Other times, it seems like we've always been together. Josephine squeezed his hand, understanding exactly what he meant. We've built a good life, Thomas, better than I ever dreamed possible when I was standing at that altar in Alta. He nodded, his gaze moving over their gathered family children, their spouses, grandchildren, friends who had become as close as family over the decades. We have indeed, he agreed, and I find myself wondering what the next 30 years might bring. Josephine laughed softly. More grandchildren, I suspect, more challenges, more joy. And through it all, Thomas said, pulling her close, us, together. Always, Josephine promised, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the life they had created unfold before them. A life born from courage and choice, nurtured by love and respect, and rich with the rewards of a journey shared. In that moment, with the setting sun painting the valley in golden light and the sound of their loved ones' laughter surrounding them, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that the greatest adventure of her life had begun that snowy day when a cowboy rode into a church and said, "Stop," and that the adventure continued still, with each sunrise bringing new possibilities for the life they had chosen together.